Hey class, welcome to Lecture 16. In Lecture 16 we are talking about the Settlement House movement. You may be familiar with the Settlement House movement, maybe by not through this particular phrase or wording. Some of you may have studied Jane Addams in middle school or high school. Jane Addams and her work in Chicago is an example of the Settlement House movement that was popular during the Progressive Era between roughly 1870 and 1920. Let's start today with a textbook account. This is from a 2003 textbook called American Visions, and it provides us with a secondary source overview of the settlement house. So let's read through this together, and then I have a couple questions that we'll talk about to introduce this. So, the social gospel. From 1870 to 1920, reformers in the social gospel movement worked to better conditions in cities according to the biblical ideals of charity and justice. An early advocate of the social gospel, Washington Gladden, a minister from Columbus, Ohio, tried to apply what he called Christian law to social problems. Walter Rauschenbusch, a Baptist minister who spent 9 years serving in a church in one of New York City's poorest neighborhoods, later led the social gospel movement. As he put it, quote, "The church must either condemn the world and seek to change it, or tolerate the world and conform to it." Unlike social Darwinists, Rauschenbusch believed that competition was the cause of many social problems, causing good people to behave badly. Now, moving into the settlement house movement. In a way, the settlement house movement was an offshoot of the social gospel movement. It attracted idealistic reformers who believed it was their Christian duty to improve living conditions for the poor. We talked about one of those people last class in our discussion of Jacob Riis, who was certainly looking to improve conditions for the poor. Right? So during the late 1800s, reformers such as Jane Addams established settlement houses in poor neighborhoods. In these establishments, middle-class residents lived and helped poor residents, mostly immigrants. Addams, who opened the famous Hull House in Chicago, 1889, inspired many more such settlements across the country, including the Henry Street settlement run by Lillian Wald in New York City. The women who ran settlement houses provided everything from medical care, recreation programs, and English classes to hot lunches for factory workers. Their efforts helped shape the social work profession, in which women came to play a major role. Again, this account comes from a 2003 textbook called The American Vision. So we're introduced to the ideas of the settlement house movement, which were grounded in the social gospel. The social gospel movement, of course, was the application of Christian principles to solve social issues. So, for instance, if there is an issue about poverty, how should we solve it? Not by raising taxes, not by handouts, not by employment, but by applying Christian laws, by helping each other. The golden rule. So let me pose a couple of questions to help us better understand this textbook's approach to teaching about the settlement house and the social gospel movement. So my first question, what was the social gospel movement? Right, the social gospel movement sought to address social problems caused by things like poverty and urbanization, the same things that Jacob Riis was trying to fit, right? He noticed that industrialization and urbanization led to a ton of poor, so he sought to change that. How did settlement houses reflect the ideas of the social gospel movement? Well, settlement houses, think of them as halfway houses. They are nestled in with all the other houses, but they were houses run to help the poor, to help the migrants. They did anything from babysitting their children to allow working moms a chance to get out and go to work. So they provided babysitting to ensure that those children in rundown houses weren't setting the place on fire. They taught immigrants how to Americanize, how to make American-style food. They taught things like literacy, how to speak English, and through this, childcare, healthcare, education, tried to help address the issues of the poor. Question 3. Describe the people who worked in settlement houses. Well, according to the textbook, we are certainly getting a sense that these are women, primarily women. We read about Lillian Wald, about Jane Addams, but they are mostly U.S. born. They themselves are not immigrants. Typically white, typically middle class, from a Protestant background, and many of them are college educated. And then finally, describe the people who received services at these settlement houses. And that's pretty clear at this point. We get a sense that these are mostly European immigrants who are poor, even though they may be working. So these are working poor European immigrants. Now, according to this textbook account, how do you think European immigrants at the turn of the century viewed social reformers like Jane Addams? According to this, they certainly seem like they are doing God's work. These are noble people. They are providing services to those who cannot provide services for themselves. These seem like good people, and I would assume after reading this that many of the European immigrants who are there using these services are probably very grateful. They see that these women as heroes. But that's not necessarily how everyone will view them. So many of the social reformers from the Progressive Era, yes, were U.S. born. They were white. Many of them were women. They were middle class. They are Protestant. They come from a college educated background. And while many historians, like those we just read, want to characterize these social reformers as generous women who wanted to assist the poor, other historians have characterized them as condescending and elitist people who wanted to make the immigrants more Christian and more American. I think if you try to think about it, I think you can come to that same conclusion. On one hand, these are generous people who are doing fundraising and service. On the other hand, there's this concern that their push is to Americanize them, have them abandon their cultural backgrounds, and adopt a more American identity. So our historical question that we are discussing today is this: what were the attitudes of settlement house social reformers towards immigrants? Are they condescending or are they generous? Or is it a mixture of both? So I have for you a series of readings that I'll ask you all to do. There are 4 primary source readings, and then we're going to do one of our debates today. So you'll see that assignment further down below, where you'll have a chance, depending on your last name, to either argue that these women were generous or to argue that these women are judgmental and condescending. And then after we do our debate in class, I will ask each of you to come back and work towards forming a consensus argument using these worksheets to build an argument in support of your claim.